Bart Ehrman, the author of 2 new books. One of them is called Misquoting Jesus, the story of who changed the Bible and why. Briefly, who did change the Bible?
Well, the New Testament that we have today was handed down over the centuries by scribes who copied the text before the invention of printing. These scribes changed the text when they copied it. Sometimes scribes, of course, would be faithful in their reproduction of the text. They'd write the words that they were copying, but sometimes they would change the words. Often this was just a matter of mistake. They would simply misspell a word or leave out a word or add an extra word or leave out a line, leave out a page. Sometimes, though, the scribes would intentionally change the text when they wanted it to say something other than it actually said. And so on occasion, scribes would change the text to make it say what they wanted it to mean.
There are a lot of people around who are very religious who, when they hear someone say they made a mistake, would probably reject that right away. Is that true? And how are those people receiving this book?
Well, there are people, of course, who think that the King James Version is the version that God handed down from heaven, and they don't understand how we actually got the Bible. No, there aren't any scholars who doubt that scribes changed the manuscripts, and in fact, nobody really can doubt this who looks at the situation, which is that we have over 5,000, over 5,400 manuscripts of the New Testament in the Greek language in which it was originally written. We don't have the originals, we have copies made centuries later. And we can compare these copies with one another. And when we compare these copies, all of them are different from one another. No 2 of them are exactly alike in their wording. So clearly somebody's changing the text. In fact, everybody's changing the text. Otherwise, we'd have copies of the New Testament that would be exactly the same. But we don't have. So scribes are clearly changing the text.
If you were to recommend to somebody a current version of the Bible to read that was closest by your estimation to whatever original is, what would you say?
I think most modern translations are done by scholars who know full well that this is a problem. And all of the modern translations try to go back to what they consider to be the original text. My own personal preference is for the New Revised Standard Version, which is a translation done by a committee with a wide range of theological and religious commitments, so that it isn't biased one way or the other, as a number of other translations are.
When you mentioned the King James Bible, take that as an example. Where does that come from?
The King James translation was done in 1611, so the early 17th century, 400 years ago now. And it was done by a very good committee of scholars in England. The difficulty with the King James translation is not its wording as far as the English goes. I mean, it's a classic of English literature that certainly should be read by everybody because it's such a great piece of literature. The problem is that these 17th century translators were basing their translation on manuscripts that were available to them. And in the 400 years intervening till now, we've discovered thousands of more manuscripts, many of them far more ancient than the ones that were available to the King James translators. So their translation is based on manuscripts that were more recent rather than more ancient, and so modern translations take that into account and provide a more accurate translation of what the original authors actually wrote.
And in your own history, as a person who studied the Bible, you've gone through a lot of changes. You originally were a fundamentalist, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I started out being interested in the Bible as a young fundamentalist Christian. I had a born-again experience when I was in high school, and decided that I wanted to study the Bible from the perspective of one who understood that it was completely without error. And so I went off to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and majored in Bible theology as a 17, 18-year-old, and was a hardcore fundamentalist who believed that there were no errors of any kind in the Bible. In part, it was my dawning understanding that we don't have the originals any longer that made me change my view, because I came to think that if we don't have the originals, then it doesn't make sense to say that the originals were without error, because we don't have the originals. We have later copies, and these copies do have errors in them. This started to undermine my faith in the inerrancy of the Bible, and eventually I came to realize that not only were the copies filled with errors, but probably the originals themselves were also written by humans, and since they were by human hands, they also had mistakes in them. And once I started realizing that that was a possibility, then I started finding mistakes and contradictions, inconsistencies, and so forth. And eventually then I gave up my faith in the Bible as being the inerrant Word of God.
How would you characterize your faith now?
Well, about 7 or 8 years ago, I became an agnostic. It wasn't an immediate leap from fundamentalism to agnosticism or anything like it. When I stopped being a fundamentalist, I was still an evangelical Christian who believed that the Bible, in some sense, was inspired. But the more I realized the kind of human problems in the Bible, and that different parts of the Bible said different things and had widely different perspectives, so that the Gospel of Mark's understanding of Jesus, in fact, is radically different from the Gospel of John's understanding of Jesus. Or the book of Genesis has a totally different understanding of what it means to be human than, say, the book of Ecclesiastes. I started seeing that these different books had different messages. I realized that this was a human book through and through. I eventually became a fairly liberal, mainstream Christian, was involved with the Lutheran Church, then an Episcopal Church, until finally about 7 or 8 years ago I realized I no longer can say the Nicene Creed in good faith. And at that point I decided I simply couldn't be a Christian anymore.
Do you know anyone who believes that the Bible is inerrant and has studied or read some of your books and changed their opinion about the Bible but retains a strong faith?
I know a lot of people who agree with me about the Bible in terms of the mistakes made by scribes, and the Bible being a very human book that has inconsistencies in it and various points of view represented in it, who still are firm believers, who understand still that Jesus is God, who think that God is almighty, and are firm believers in every sense. But they simply don't have this fundamentalist view of the Bible or this evangelical view of the Bible.
You think this book, your book, Misquoting Jesus, has political implications because of religious conservatives now and looking to the Bible for inspiration for political ideas?
The religious right, of course, uses the Bible to support its own political agendas. And one of the things that I came to realize a long time ago is that you can quote the Bible for just about any agenda that you want. That's why you have the Bible being quoted on the House floor or the Senate floor all the time by people taking different points of view, and not just in Congress, but also just in daily debates about issues such as abortion or nuclear proliferation or the war in Iraq. People can quote the Bible. It's because the Bible isn't one thing. The Bible's a lot of things written by a lot of different authors in a lot of different time periods with a lot of different points of view. So the Bible simply can't be used to settle any particular question, because the Bible has lots of answers to lots of questions, and so I think that that's probably a misuse of the Bible to try and use it to promote a particular political agenda.
Your newest book is about the Gospel of Judas. Could you describe basically how that came about?
The Gospel of Judas just appeared 6 months ago. It had actually been discovered in 1978, but now has come to light by scholars translating it and making it public 6 months ago. And so I've written a book about the Gospel of Judas as one of our earliest Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. It's a fascinating book, the Gospel of Judas, because it shows Judas not as the villain of the gospel story, but as the hero. He's the hero because in the Gospel of Judas, Jesus and Judas agree that Judas is going to betray Jesus. And they agree on this because in this gospel, Jesus, like many of us, is a spirit who's entrapped in a human body who needs to escape. His body has to die so his spirit can escape, and Judas is the one who makes it possible. So Judas is portrayed as the good guy in the story, and he's the one who's the closest disciple to Jesus, the one to whom Jesus can deliver a secret revelation about how we can escape this body of ours to return to our heavenly home.
You are relatively young, and you've already written 19 books, is that, or edited that many? And you've touched on so many subjects in your work. Where do you go now?
Well, the next book I'm writing for a popular audience is actually going to be the problem that shifted me from being a believer to being an agnostic. It's the problem of how we account for suffering and pain in the world. I came to a point where I could no longer reconcile my belief in an all-powerful God who was a loving God, who was in control of this world, with the state of the world, with the pain and the suffering that's so rampant. And so I'm going to be writing a book on how different biblical authors deal with this problem of suffering, and how there are different answers for why there's suffering in different parts of the Bible, so that Job has one answer, Ecclesiastes has another answer, the Psalms have another answer, the prophets have another answer, and so it'll be wrestling with this problem of suffering from a biblical perspective.